Okay, we're on, and we're continuing the conversation about non-religious elements in the scripture, like which happens to be false. For example, that the Bible was is not true because it was recounted centuries after Jesus.
Well, right. So it's a human created document, and then most modern scholars looking at any of these scriptures, Christian scripture, Jewish scripture, Muslim scripture, or others, are looking at them as human written documents of various particular times and places, and sometimes we know the actual author, not always. And so modern scholars, secular scholars, look at the writings in their cultural context to try to understand them, and then look for example, in the Christian scriptures, you've got very obvious gospels by different authors. Sometimes they're called the synoptic gospels because they're all focused on the life of Jesus and they're focusing on the same point, but they have differences among them. And so there, it's clear that we're getting different individual people's viewpoints, and maybe even groups of people, that the authors not only represent themselves, but maybe their own sub-circle of people. And likewise, in the Jewish or Hebrew Bible or scriptures, you find similarly scholars identifying multiple authors and differences among them. So even though we might think of Genesis, for example, the first book of the Hebrew Bible, as or Old Testament, as the Christians refer to it, as one book, right within the first two chapters you have two different creation stories that are different, and they're not consistent. Because clearly, for example, most obviously, you've got the first story that talks about humans, female and male, being created simultaneously after animals. In the second chapter, you have a different story where Adam, apparently a sexless human, is created, is looking a little lonely, and the deity is saying like, "Hey, what's up? Maybe I should make you company." Well, no, first he makes the animals. The deity makes the animals his company and says like, "Oh, look at these great animals. You can give them names, you can hang out with them, and the human, Adam, gives the animals names and is hanging out with them. He's not quite exactly a great fit for the human. And so, deity, light bulb, goes off, big idea. Oh, I've got a different idea for a company. It creates the female human. Apparently now the original human is male, because what would it make sense that it would be male without the female? Anyway, so it's a different story. And there are multiple versions of things like two different flood stories, many other variations on stories, because it's folklore. And they're the same stories about creation or the flood or whatever occur in variations in human folklore everywhere. We have zillions of creation stories. We got all sorts of stories of gods and goddesses of various types, from volcano gods to wind gods and storm gods.
And exactly. So, which one is true? So, which one is true?
Well, see.
So, that's my problem with religions overall. So,
well, it's not factually true, but here's the deal. It's I think it'd be mistaken to dismiss it as foolishness if you don't look at it as literature.
It is literature, right?
Then it gives you, it can give you an insight into what ancient peoples, or even contemporary people, believe, think, feel. So it doesn't give you factual truth about what happened. It gives you a truth of an insight into the human condition, with all of its foibles and inspirations.
The human condition is basically that we are scared of death, and so we tend to make up stories about what life.
And we don't really know how we all came to exist in this world. I mean, we're still figuring that out. I mean, you think about how the Big Bang theory is a very recent theory. We're still figuring it out.
It's a recent theory, but it's more reliable than the Bible.
Oh, it's much more reliable. But calling it a theory, I just mean it conforms.
It's not like this world was created 5,000 years ago.
No. I'm just pointing out that we're in a position of looking back and saying, like, well, how could they think all that stuff? But it's like, we just figured out the Big Bang, just a few decades ago.
I mean, but there were people who were questioning it even centuries ago, and they were persecuted afterwards because they did not believe.
No. But it's one thing to question a story or a claim that turns out to be untrue. It's another thing to actually figure out the truth of what actually did happen. My point being that science, in this case astrophysics and so on, is figuring out a very difficult question that we only recently even have had tools that we could get those kinds of measurements. For example, that we could get readings of the distance of stars, through using the Cepheids that pulse, and using things like evaluating the redshift, so we could see that the stars were moving away from us. We've only recently had all these kinds of tools to begin to understand that the universe is not stationary but expanding, that it's expanding apparently from a common center point, which is an interesting thing, which then suggests that if you reverse the time dimension, you're going back to that center point from which a creation or event, an origination event occurred from that singularity. So we've only gotten our heads around that in the last few decades, and I would argue that cultural and psychological change takes some amount of time for a society to really reorient itself. So to understand the human existence in the context of a cosmos that is much older than we might have imagined it, not from that biblical creation, but from a cosmic Big Bang event. And that, it also then raises the questions along with, of course, Darwinian evolutionary theory, that humans are not, an organism that was, designed by a deity or nature. We're kind of a random occurrence in the cosmos that wasn't designed either. And so then it raises questions of meaning, and those are very difficult questions, I think, for a lot of people to suddenly switch from all the folkloric ideas and religious ideas, thinking ourselves to be very special. And we can feel ourselves special and think of each other as special in regard for each other and regard for our human condition. But the universe doesn't think of us as special necessarily. So it's like thinking your mom or dad doesn't think you're special, because if there's no God who created us to be special. For some people, that's a real letdown, and for others, it's like, well, I guess we'll have to figure this out on our own kind of challenge and inspiration. And I think that's how many humanists and philosophical naturalists look at it.
I would like to talk about specific cases. You mentioned the culture earlier, but it seems to me that, for example, there have been cases that I've raised. You were mentioning Iran earlier, but there have been cases, for example, in Afghanistan, where females who were questioning God were consequently, persecuted by their own society, socially excluded, and then they kind of managed to get to Europe or to the US. It seems to me, though, it doesn't work like that when you are in the US and you happen to be black. What's your experience with that?
I'm not sure I followed. I understand the question about people being persecuted in other countries around their religious, beliefs, disbeliefs in this case. But the parallel between that and being black in the United States?
Yes, a black atheist, black non-believer, you could say, could be persecuted for not having a religion. Or he could be also socially excluded.
Socially excluded, I would think, is more common because, it was interesting. I don't know if you saw this, CBS Sunday morning, just this last weekend, there was a segment on this upcoming openly secular day, which was today, right?
Yes.
It's today. Happy openly secular day. So there was a segment on, did you see that on African Americans?